My mom abandoned me, and my cruel stepdad kicked me out. Years later, they're back begging for help. And I told them this. My story begins with a love that was once warm, a home that was once happy, and a life that seemed to be on a predictable path until one day everything changed. I was just 10 years old, an age where the world should still be full of innocence and wonder. But for me, it was the year that everything shattered. The year I lost my father to a tragic car accident. I remember how my mother crumpled at the news, her shoulders shaking with tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than sadness. My world dimmed that day. And for a while, there was only a numbness that settled in the house, an emptiness where my father's laughter used to echo. In those days, I clung to my mother as the only family I had left. And she tried her best. She really did. We struggled, both financially and emotionally, and it felt like we were just drifting, holding on by our fingertips. My mom did everything she could to make ends meet, picking up extra shifts, taking odd jobs, and trying to put on a brave face for me. I saw her exhaustion, the way she would come home late, her eyes red from fatigue. For a while, I thought things could still be okay. But then Mark entered our lives. My mom met Mark when I was 12. He seemed nice enough at first. Or maybe it was just my mother's smile that made him seem that way. She hadn't smiled in a long time. And when she looked at Mark, her eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen since before my father died. I wanted to like him. I wanted to believe he could make us whole again. And for a while, it seemed like he could. He was charming, attentive, always bringing flowers or small gifts for my mother. I remember the day they announced their engagement. My mom was beaming, tears of happiness filling her eyes as she looked at him. But even at the wedding, I could feel something was wrong. Mark's gaze was cold when it fell on me. He would smile at my mother, but when he looked at me, his eyes would narrow, calculating, as though he were assessing a problem that needed fixing. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just the nerves of a new family member trying to fit in. But deep down, I knew something was off. And it wasn't long before Mark dropped the act entirely. Living with Mark was like trying to sleep next to a ticking time bomb. I never knew what would set him off. He didn't just dislike me, he despised me. He saw me as a burden, a reminder of my mother's past, of her love for someone else. Every day became a challenge to stay out of his way, to avoid his glares and cutting remarks. No matter how hard I tried, nothing was ever enough. I kept my grades up, helped around the house, even tried to engage in activities he liked, like football, but he would always find something to criticize. He'd call me lazy, useless, a waste of space, and my mother, caught between us, would always side with Mark to keep the peace. The worst part was when my mother took a job overseas. It was an incredible opportunity for her, a 6-month contract that could turn into something permanent. I remember the excitement in her eyes when she told me, and I tried to share in her joy. But all I could feel was dread. The thought of being alone with Mark terrified me. I tried to tell her about the things he did, how he treated me when she wasn't around. But she brushed it off. Mark is just tough, she said. You need to give him a chance. She wanted so badly for this new life to work, for this new family to be whole, that she couldn't, or wouldn't, see what was happening. The day she left was one of the hardest of my life. I hugged her tightly at the airport, my throat aching as I fought back tears. I wanted to beg her to stay, to not leave me alone with him, but I couldn't. I knew how much this meant to her, and I didn't want to be the one to hold her back. As she walked through security, Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. It looked like a comforting gesture, but his grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin. He leaned in and whispered, "Things are going to be different now, boy," and they were. From the moment we got home, Mark's hostility escalated. He'd scream at me for the smallest things, leaving a dish in the sink, coming home 5 minutes late. One day, I forgot to turn off my bedroom light, and when I came home from school, I found that he had removed all the light bulbs from my room. "You don't deserve to have any if you can't remember to turn them off," he said with a grin. He threatened to kick me out constantly, saying my mother would believe him over me any day. And as much as it hurt, I knew he was right. My mother had chosen him, and she would choose him again. I tried to keep my head down, to avoid confrontation, but it was impossible. The stress was unbearable. My grades started to slip, and I could feel myself falling apart. I called my mother several times, trying to tell her what was happening, But she was always busy with work. Always dismissive. Just work it out with Mark, she'd say. I could hear the stress in her voice. And I didn't want to add to her burden. I felt so alone, trapped in a situation that seemed to have no way out. One night, things reached a breaking point. I had been working late, covering a shift for a sick coworker. And when I got home, Mark was waiting for me. He accused me of lying, of doing drugs, of getting into trouble. He grabbed a box that held some of my most precious belongings, old photos, my dad's watch, school keepsakes, and threatened to throw it all out. I begged him to stop. And in the struggle, the box fell, its contents scattering across the floor. He looked at me with disgust and said, "I want you out of my house by tomorrow." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left that night, sneaking out once Mark had gone to bed. I crashed at a friend's place for a few days before finding a small room to rent. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was better than living under Mark's roof. I didn't tell my mother right away. I didn't want to jeopardize her job. I thought I could explain everything when she got back, that she would understand, but Mark had other plans. When my mother returned, she was cold, distant. She accused me of stealing money from Mark, of running away to avoid facing the consequences. He had fabricated evidence, shown her fake bank statements, and convinced her that I was a thief. No matter how much I tried to explain, she wouldn't listen. She had already made up her mind. She looked at me with disappointment, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any of Mark's insults. She told me she needed time to think, that she couldn't have me back in the house if she couldn't trust me. And just like that, I lost not only my home but my mother as well. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I struggled to make ends meet, working long hours while trying to keep up with school. I was constantly exhausted, barely eating, and my grades suffered. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of everything pulling me down. But then, a teacher noticed. She pulled me aside one day and asked what was going on. At first, I was hesitant to tell her, but something in her eyes made me trust her. She listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was on my side. With her help, I got in touch with a social worker and a school counselor. They helped me get back on track, provided me with resources, and even helped me secure some financial aid. Slowly, I began to piece my life back together. I focused on my studies, determined to graduate and build a future for myself. I knew I couldn't rely on my mother or anyone else. I had to do this on my own. After high school, I managed to get a scholarship to study computer science at a state university. I threw myself into my studies, taking on multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. It was exhausting, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. I wasn't just surviving, I was building something for myself. I made friends, found mentors, and even started seeing a therapist to help me work through the trauma of my past. It wasn't easy, but I was finally starting to feel like I could breathe again. I graduated with honors and landed a job at a tech startup. The work was challenging, but I loved it. I felt valued for my skills and my work ethic, something I had never felt at home. I worked my way up, starting as a junior developer and eventually becoming the lead developer for one of our main projects. The company grew, and with it, so did my career. I moved into a better apartment, bought my first car, and for the first time in my life, I felt stable. Then, out of the blue, my mother reached out. It had been 5 years since we last spoke, and hearing her voice again brought a rush of emotions: hope, anger, sadness. She sounded tired, desperate. She told me that she and Mark were having financial troubles and asked if we could meet to talk. Part of me had dreamed of this moment for years, of my mother finally reaching out, of us reconciling. But when I met her at the cafe, Mark was there too. They were different now. My mother was more assertive, interrupting Mark when he spoke, while Mark seemed subdued, a shadow of the man who had terrorized me for years. They were asking for my help, financial help. Mark even apologized, admitting that he had let his insecurities get the better of him, that he had treated me horribly. My mother looked at me with pleading eyes, and for a moment, I saw the woman she used to be, the mother who had once been my whole world. I listened to them, my heart torn. I thought about all the nights I had spent alone, struggling to make it on my own. I thought about the betrayal, the way my mother had chosen Mark over me, the way she had believed his lies. I had worked so hard to build a life for myself, to prove that I didn't need them. And now they were here, asking for my help. I told them I needed time to think. And I left the cafe, my mind swirling with emotions. Part of me wanted to help. Despite everything, she was still my mother. I didn't want to see her suffer. But another part of me was terrified that helping them would pull me back into that dark place. That I would lose myself again in the process. I had come so far, built so much, and I wasn't sure if I could risk it all for people who had hurt me so deeply. In the end, I realized that I had to put myself first. I couldn't go back to that life. Couldn't let myself be dragged down again. I decided not to help them financially. But I did offer to meet with my mother again. Without Mark, I wanted to try to rebuild something with her. Even if it was just a small connection. I didn't know if it would work, or if she would even agree. But I had to try. Not for her, but for me. The past 5 years have taught me so much about resilience. About the importance of standing up for yourself even when it feels like the whole world is against you. I've learned that sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most can hurt you the deepest. And that it's okay to walk away from them if it means saving yourself. I've learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you. Who lift you up when you're at your lowest. I don't know what the future holds for me and my mother. Maybe we'll be able to rebuild our relationship. Maybe we won't. But I do know that I'm not the same scared kid I was all those years ago. I'm stronger now. And I have a life that I'm proud of. A life that I built for myself. And no matter what happens, I won't let anyone take that away from me. This is a story of pain, betrayal, and ultimately, resilience. It's a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there is always a way forward. Always a way to build a better life for yourself. And while the past may haunt us, it doesn't have to define us. We have the power to choose our own path, to create our own future, and to find our own happiness. My girlfriend of 10 years left me after getting pregnant with my younger brother. Now, 6 years later, a terrible event has unfolded. Once upon a time, in a small town where everyone knew each other's names and secrets, lived a young man named David. David believed he had everything anyone could wish for, a deep, unwavering love with his high school sweetheart and a close-knit family that he trusted implicitly. His love, Rebecca, was someone he had cherished since they were both 16. She was the center of his world, and their relationship had grown through the years. From their teenage days spent laughing in high school corridors to late-night phone calls during their time at different colleges. David and Rebecca were inseparable. They were that couple people looked up to, the ones who gave hope that true love really existed. David had gone to great lengths to make their moments together special. Like saving money for their first date at a decent local restaurant and surprising her with a scavenger hunt around town for her 17th birthday. Culminating in a picnic at the park. He was the type of partner who would drive hours just to see Rebecca during her college years. Bringing care packages filled with her favorite treats to help her through stressful exams. His love for her was not just a fleeting romance, it was a commitment. A promise to always be there. At 26, David and Rebecca were ready to make their relationship official by getting married. They had worked hard to get there. David had taken on extra jobs to support Rebecca's dream of pursuing a master's degree. Staying up late to help her study even when he had early shifts the next day. He did everything he could to make sure Rebecca was happy, believing that their future together was going to be bright and beautiful. He had even planned a magical proposal, recreating their first date at the same restaurant, wearing similar clothes, and, as if guided by fate, accidentally spilling his water glass again, just like on their first date. It was perfect. Rebecca laughed just as she had back then. And he proposed under the stars, sealing their love in what he believed would be forever. But life doesn't always follow the script we lay out for it. A few days before what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, their wedding day, David's world crumbled in a way that he could have never imagined. Rebecca came to him with startling news. She was pregnant, but the baby wasn't his. It was William's, David's younger brother, someone David had always loved, trusted, and protected. The revelation hit David like a thunderbolt, leaving him disoriented and broken. The person he had loved more than anyone else, the person he had shared his dreams with, had betrayed him with his own brother. What made the situation even more unbearable was how his family responded. Instead of standing by David in his moment of need, his parents urged him to forgive. They wanted him to understand and be supportive, not of him, but of his younger brother. They were ecstatic at the idea of becoming grandparents, more so than they were concerned about David's heartbreak. They treated William as if he could do no wrong. He had always been their golden child. David, on the other hand, felt abandoned, his pain dismissed as an inconvenience in the wake of their excitement for the new baby. It was as though everything he had worked for, every dream he had nurtured, had been snatched away, and no one seemed to care. Overwhelmed by betrayal, heartbreak, and the feeling of being utterly alone, David made the difficult decision to leave. He packed his belongings and moved to a different city, far away from his family, from Rebekah, and from the memories that haunted him. He needed distance, he needed to find himself again, to understand who he was without Rebekah and without the family that had chosen to support his brother over him. He cut off all communication, needing time to heal and put the shattered pieces of his heart back together. The next 6 years were not easy. Moving to a new city with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to survive. David slowly began to rebuild his life. He focused on his career, pouring all his energy into his work. He built new friendships, people who knew nothing of his past and the pain he had endured. He even started dating again, though he struggled to let anyone get too close. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, and David had learned that the hard way. The scars of betrayal were still there, and he carried them with him, even as he tried to move forward. Just when David thought he had managed to leave the past behind, his mother called. Her voice, one he hadn't heard in 6 years, brought back a flood of memories. She wasn't calling to apologize or to ask for forgiveness. Instead, she was calling because William had been in an accident, a terrible accident that had left him paralyzed. She needed David to come back, to help the family, to be there for Rebekah and William's child, to be the father figure that the boy needed now that William was unable to provide. Hearing his mother's request, David felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, disbelief. It was as if nothing had changed. His family's expectations were still the same. They wanted him to sacrifice his own well-being for the sake of his brother and Rebekah. They expected him to forgive, to forget the betrayal, and to step into a role that they thought he owed them. But David had spent the last 6 years learning how to protect himself. Learning that his own needs mattered too. He had built a new life, and he wasn't ready to throw it all away just because his family suddenly needed him. After weeks of constant phone calls and messages from his parents, David decided to visit his brother in the hospital. He wasn't sure what he would find, or how he would feel seeing William again after so many years. As he walked into the hospital room, he saw his once vibrant, athletic brother lying in bed, frail and connected to numerous machines. It was a sight that shocked David, stirring feelings of pity despite the betrayal. His parents were there too, looking older, worn down by the years and by the weight of their worries. When they saw David, they rushed to embrace him, but he held back, not ready for that kind of closeness. Then, David saw Rebekah. She was standing beside William's bed, looking tired and worried. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Memories of their past flooded back, memories of the love they had shared, the dreams they had built together, and the betrayal that had torn it all apart. Seeing Rebekah again brought back all the pain David had tried so hard to bury. He avoided talking to her, focusing instead on his father. Asking about William's condition, his father explained that William had suffered a spinal cord injury in a car accident, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors were uncertain if he would ever walk again. As they were talking, a small child entered the room, a boy around 5 or 6 years old. David knew immediately that this was William and Rebekah's son, his nephew. The boy looked at him with curious eyes, and Rebekah introduced David as his uncle. David spent a few minutes talking to the boy, asking about his favorite toys and games, feeling an odd sense of connection to this child he had never met before. Later, his mother insisted that they go back to the house to talk. David reluctantly agreed, wanting to get it over with. At the house, his mother began a long speech about family responsibilities and how David needed to step up to help Rebekah and William's child. She spoke of how overwhelmed Rebekah was, trying to take care of William, raise their son, and manage everything on her own. As David listened, he felt his anger grow. His mother hadn't changed. She was still thinking only of William, still expecting David to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of his brother. When she finally stopped, David told her exactly how he felt. He pointed out that she had never once asked about him, about how he was doing, or about his life over the past 6 years. She had only reached out because she needed something from him, not because she genuinely cared about mending their relationship. He reminded her of how they had supported William and Rebecca over him, how they had dismissed his pain and expected him to simply accept their betrayal. He told her that he was not willing to give up the life he had built for himself, the peace of mind he had worked so hard to achieve, just to step into a role that they wanted him to fill. David made it clear that he was open to rebuilding a relationship with his family, but only if they were willing to acknowledge the pain they had caused and respect his boundaries. He told them that he would not be a father figure for William's child, and that he would not sacrifice his own well-being for their sake. His parents were furious, accusing him of abandoning his family when they needed him the most. But David stood firm. 6 years ago, they had made their choice. They had chosen to support William and Rebecca over him. Now, they had to live with the consequences of that choice. As David drove back home that night, he felt a mix of emotions. Part of him felt guilty, especially for his nephew, who was growing up with a father who could no longer be fully present. But another part of him felt a sense of relief. For the first time, he had stood up for himself. He had set boundaries, and he had made it clear that his own needs mattered too. He had learned that while family is important, it does not give anyone the right to mistreat you or to expect you to sacrifice your own happiness for theirs. In the weeks that followed, David's parents called a few times. The conversations were strained, but they seemed to be trying, asking about his life, showing interest in what he was doing, rather than just talking about William. It was a small step, but it gave David hope that maybe, with time, they could rebuild their relationship in a healthier way. For now, David was focused on his own life. He had started seeing a therapist again, working through the emotions that had resurfaced since reconnecting with his family. He was putting his energy into his work, spending time with friends who had supported him through everything, and slowly, cautiously, allowing himself to think about the possibility of a future where he could be close to his family again, but only on his terms, and only if they respected his boundaries. David's story is one of resilience, of learning to value oneself even when those closest to you failed to do so. It is a story of heartbreak, of betrayal, but also of hope and healing. David learned that true love, whether romantic or familial, is not about blind loyalty or sacrifice. It is about mutual respect, understanding, and support. He learned that it is okay to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they are family, and that sometimes the best way to love others is to first love and protect yourself. Through his journey, David shows us that healing is not about erasing the past but about learning to live fully despite it. It is about setting boundaries, standing up for oneself, and recognizing that we all deserve to be treated with respect and love. His story is a reminder that while forgiveness is a beautiful thing, it should never come at the cost of one's own well-being, and most importantly, it teaches us that true strength lies not in enduring pain silently but in having the courage to walk away from what no longer serves us and to build a life that brings us peace and happiness.